They promised us the end of waiting. 10 minutes. That was the contract. A pint of milk, a pack of cigarettes, or a single avocado delivered to your doorstep before you could even finish a TikTok scroll. In the winter of 2021, the streets of London, Berlin, and New York were being quietly colonized, not by an army, but by a fleet of silent electric ghosts. They were everywhere, shimmering in purple and yellow. They didn't use storefronts. They didn't want you to come inside. They operated out of dark stores, blacked-out windows in residential neighborhoods where the only sign of life was the frantic hum of a packing station. But while you were getting your $5 convenience fix, something was bleeding out. Behind the slick apps and the billionaire-backed marketing was a mathematical suicide pact, a machine built to consume billions of dollars in venture capital just to save you a walk to the corner shop. And then, almost overnight, the lights in the dark stores went out. The mopeds vanished. A company once valued at nearly $12 billion was sold for scraps. This isn't a story about groceries. It's a story about the greatest wealth-burning machine in the history of the modern world. It's about how we were sold a future that was physically impossible, and why the people who built it knew it was going to fail from the very first delivery. In 2021, the world was in a fever dream. Interest rates were at zero. Money wasn't just cheap, it was a burden. Billion-dollar venture capital firms like SoftBank and Mubadala were looking for a place to dump it. They found it in a concept called quick commerce. The logic was simple. Whoever owns the last mile owns the consumer. If you can become the invisible hand that feeds a city, you become more powerful than the supermarkets. But there was a problem, a fatal structural rot at the core of the business. To deliver a $5 bag of chips in 10 minutes, you need a dark store within 2 miles of every customer. You need to pay for prime real estate in the middle of expensive cities, but you can't have any foot traffic. You need to pay a rider to wait for the order and another person to pack it. The math didn't just look bad, it looked like a crime scene. For every order placed, Getir wasn't making money, they were losing it. Sometimes $5 per order, sometimes $15. In its peak expansion, the company was burning through $50 million every single month. They weren't selling groceries, they were selling $10 bills for $5, and the world was more than happy to buy them. But how long can you sell a loss before the money runs out? But who was the architect of this chaos? The name Getir means to bring in Turkish. Its founder, Nazim Salur, didn't view himself as a grocer, he viewed himself as a disruptor of time itself. He didn't want to compete with the local shop, he wanted to make the local shop obsolete. He didn't do market research, he didn't use science, he used raw, unadulterated speed. Salur's vision was a ghost store on every corner, but to achieve that, he needed an army that didn't ask questions. The 10-minute promise wasn't a service, it was a weapon used to bludgeon the competition. But here's the part they don't tell you. The riders weren't the only ones under pressure. The entire system was a house of cards waiting for the wind to change. The dark stores were often operating in legal gray zones, annoying neighbors with constant noise and facing crackdowns from city planners. It was a business model built for a world that stayed indoors forever. It was a business model built on a pandemic. In 2022, the world woke up. Inflation spiked. The era of free money ended. Suddenly, investors weren't asking about market share, they were asking a question that Getir hadn't prepared for. When do you actually make a profit? The answer was, never. This is where things get uncomfortable. As the funding dried up, Getir didn't slow down, they doubled down. In a move that shocked the industry, they bought their biggest rival, Gorillas, for $1.2 billion. But look closer at the deal. Gorillas had been valued at $3 billion just months earlier. This wasn't a merger of strength, it was two drowning people grabbing onto each other, hoping that by becoming bigger, they would somehow become more buoyant. It didn't work. The combined entity was now burning cash at a rate that would make a government blush. By 2023, the system began to purge the delivery virus. Cities like Amsterdam and Barcelona began banning dark stores. Residents complained they were living next to industrial warehouses in residential zones. The surveillance of the model was total, but the sustainability was zero. Power noticed the threat, but it wasn't the government that killed Getir, it was the math. The valuation that once sat at $11.8 billion began to bleed out. In the private markets, the company's worth was slashed by 80%. They weren't a unicorn, they were a cautionary tale. And then the silence began. In April 2024, the announcement finally came. Getir, the company that had colonized the Western world, was vanishing. They announced a total withdrawal from the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, and the United States. Thousands of workers were left in the cold. Franchises were left with warehouses full of rotting fruit and branded mopeds they couldn't sell. Within days of the announcement, UK franchises were selling off equipment for pennies on the dollar. The ghosts had been exorcised. But why did they have to vanish? Because they were never meant to stay. They were a financial product, not a service. Once the product, the company, could no longer be sold to the next investor for a higher price, the service had no reason to exist. But here is the final haunting twist. In February 2026, the final act was played out. Uber, the very giant Getir tried to disrupt, moved in for the kill. They didn't buy the global empire. They didn't buy the $12 billion dream. They bought the remaining Turkish business for a mere $435 million. Wait, think about that. Nearly $11 billion in perceived value simply vanished. It wasn't stolen, it wasn't lost in a bad trade, it never existed. It was a hallucination fueled by cheap money and our own desire to never have to leave our houses again. Today, the 10-minute promise is a ghost story. The apps that remain have quietly moved their delivery times to 30 minutes, 60 minutes, or sometime today. The prices have gone up, the discounts have vanished. We are back to where we started, only now the corner shops are gone, replaced by empty dark stores that no one knows how to fill. The next time you see a countdown timer on your screen, ask yourself who is really paying for those seconds. Because in the world of venture capital, nothing is ever truly instant. It just takes a few years for the bill to arrive. And when it does, it's always more than you can afford to pay.